What would you do if you were beaten in your hospital bed while 7 months pregnant, and your own husband watched it happen? Vivian Caldwell had everything taken from her. Her career, her freedom, her sanity. According to the forged medical records her husband created, the mistress visited 3 times with that belt. The doctor said she was delusional. The police apologized to her abuser. Everyone failed her. Everyone except one person they never expected. Her father, a man who knew exactly how to destroy people who thought they were untouchable. Like and subscribe if you believe in justice. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? The belt came down 3 times before Vivian could scream. Not on her back, not on her legs, on her arms, the only part she could use to shield her 7-month pregnant belly from the woman beating her. The husband stood in the doorway, watching, checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. But that moment had not arrived yet. 3 days earlier, Vivian Caldwell Whitmore lay in her private suite at St. Helena Memorial Hospital, staring at the ceiling tiles and counting her breaths. The fetal monitor beside her bed emitted a steady rhythm, each beep confirming that her daughter was still alive inside her. She placed one hand over her swollen abdomen and felt the subtle movement beneath her palm. 7 months. She had made it 7 months despite everything. The diagnosis had been clear and terrifying. Threatened preterm labor caused by prolonged psychological stress. The doctor had used words like bed rest, continuous monitoring, and absolutely no emotional agitation. Vivian had nodded along, pretending she did not know exactly what had caused her body to rebel against her. 4 years of marriage to Garrett Whitmore had taught her many things. How to smile when she wanted to scream. How to apologize for things that were not her fault. How to shrink herself small enough to fit inside the life he had designed for her. She had been a corporate lawyer once, top of her class at Columbia, the youngest associate ever promoted at Sullivan and Partners. Her father had been so proud the day she passed the bar. Theodore Caldwell had spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor, and watching his daughter follow in his footsteps had meant everything to him. Then Garrett happened. He had been charming in the beginning. They always were. He swept into her life with his old money confidence and his promises of forever. He told her she worked too hard. He told her she deserved to be taken care of. He told her that a woman of her intelligence was wasted in a courtroom when she could be building a family. She believed him. God help her. She believed every word. The isolation came gradually. First it was the job, then it was her friends, who Garrett deemed too negative, too jealous of her happiness. Then it was her father, who had seen through Garrett from the very first dinner and made the mistake of saying so out loud. Their last conversation still echoed in her memory. Theodore had stood in her living room, his face tight with concern, and told her that Garrett Whitmore would destroy her. She had chosen her husband over her father that day. She had not spoken to Theodore in 3 years. Now she lay alone in a hospital bed, understanding with painful clarity how right her father had been. The door opened and Vivian tensed automatically before recognizing the nurse who entered. Dorothy Marsh was perhaps 58 years old with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes that seemed to notice everything. She had been assigned to Vivian since admission, and something about her steady presence felt like safety. "How are we feeling this afternoon, Miss Whitmore?" Dorothy asked, checking the monitors with practiced efficiency. "Tired," Vivian admitted, "but the contractions have stopped." "That is good news. Your body is responding well to the rest." Dorothy adjusted the IV line and made a note on her tablet. "Your husband called. He said he would be by this evening." Something flickered across Vivian's face before she could stop it. Dorothy paused, her pen hovering over the screen. "Is everything all right at home, dear?" The question hung in the air between them. Vivian opened her mouth to deliver the familiar lies, but exhaustion made her honest. "Everything is fine," she said, and even she could hear how hollow the words sounded. Dorothy studied her for a long moment. Then she simply nodded and finished her notes. "I will be right outside if you need anything. Anything at all." After the nurse left, Vivian noticed Garrett's phone sitting on the charging station beside the window. He had forgotten it during his morning visit, too distracted by whatever business deal consumed him to remember the device that controlled his entire life. She should not look. She knew she should not look. But something pulled her out of the bed despite the doctor's orders, her bare feet touching the cold floor as she crossed the room with one hand supporting her belly. The phone was unlocked. Garrett never bothered with passwords because he never expected anyone to challenge him. Vivian opened his messages and felt her world collapse. The contact was saved simply as N. The most recent text had arrived 20 minutes ago. Is she broken yet? Garrett's response sat below it. Almost. The stress is doing its job. Doctor says she could deliver any day now if we keep the pressure up. Vivian scrolled further, her hands trembling. Weeks of messages revealed themselves. Natasha asking when they could finally be together. Garrett assuring her that the baby was necessary for the inheritance, but the wife was disposable. References to making Vivian appear mentally unstable so that Garrett could take custody once the child was born. They were not just having an affair. They were planning to destroy her. Vivian's legal training kicked in before the panic could overwhelm her. She pulled up her own phone from beneath her mattress, where she had hidden it from Garrett's watchful eyes, and began taking screenshots. Every message, every damning word, evidence that would hold up in any courtroom. She had just finished when footsteps approached in the hallway. Vivian scrambled back to bed, sliding her phone under the mattress and her racing heart behind a mask of calm. She arranged herself against the pillows just as the door handle turned. It was not Garrett. The woman who entered wore a deep crimson dress that looked obscenely expensive against the sterile white walls. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders. Her makeup was flawless. Her smile was sharp enough to cut. Natasha Brennan closed the door behind her and turned the lock with deliberate care. "So," she said softly, "you must be the wife." Vivian's fingers tightened around the blanket as Natasha stepped closer to the bed. The click of her designer heels against the floor sounded impossibly loud in the small room. "I have heard so much about you," Natasha continued, her voice sweet as poison. "Garrett talks about you constantly. His fragile little wife who cannot handle the pressures of being a Whitmore. You need to leave." Vivian kept her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I am calling the nurse." She reached for the call button mounted near the bed rail, but Natasha was faster. She caught Vivian's wrist and pushed it firmly back onto the mattress. "I would not do that if I were you." Natasha leaned closer, her perfume overwhelming in the confined space. Something floral and expensive that Vivian committed to memory. Evidence. Everything was evidence now. "We need to have a conversation first." "I have nothing to say to you," Natasha laughed, the sound bright and terrible. "That is adorable, Yehindi. You think you have a choice, Dima." She reached into her designer handbag and slowly withdrew a black leather belt. Vivian recognized it immediately. It was Garrett's. He had worn it to their wedding. "Do you know what stress does to a pregnancy?" Natasha asked conversationally, letting the belt hang loose from her fingers. "It releases cortisol into the bloodstream, tightens the uterine muscles. In a woman already experiencing preterm labor symptoms, well," she shrugged elegantly, "nature takes its course." "Please, Ava," the word escaped before Vivian could stop it. "The baby?" "That is exactly my point." Natasha raised the belt. "Every time you fight back, every time you try to cause problems, I will be here to remind you of the consequences. Your stress awes my work for me, Bembamasi." The first strike came down across Vivian's forearm with a crack that seemed to echo off the walls. Pain exploded through her arm, and she cried out, instinctively curling inward to protect her belly. The fetal monitor beside her stuttered, its steady rhythm faltering. Natasha struck again, aiming for Vivian's shoulders and upper arms, areas half covered by the hospital gown, areas that could be hidden. "Quiet," Natasha hissed. "You are not going to make a scene." Vivian bit down on her lip hard enough to draw blood, stifling the screams that wanted to tear from her throat. Tears streamed down her face as the belt fell again and again. She memorized everything through the haze of pain. The exact time on the clock, 12:47, the way Natasha angled her strikes to avoid visible areas. The words she spoke. Evidence. It was all evidence. The monitor beside her bed began beeping faster, more erratically. The numbers on the screen climbed and dipped in alarming waves. Vivian felt her daughter moving frantically inside her, disturbed by the flood of stress hormones. "There, madame." "There," Natasha said finally, stepping back to examine her work. "Something to remember me by." She tucked the belt back into her bag and smoothed down her dress as if nothing had happened. Then she leaned over Vivian one final time, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you talk, if you try to fight, If you do anything except lie here and be quiet, I will come back. And next time, I will not be so careful about where I aim." She unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway, pulling it closed behind her. Vivian lay frozen, her body shaking violently. The burning in her arms competed with the terror in her chest. She forced herself to breathe slowly, desperately trying to calm her racing heart before the monitor triggered an alarm. When she could move again, she pulled her phone from beneath the mattress and opened the Notes app. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely type, but she forced herself to document everything: time, location, exact words spoken, description of injuries. She had just finished hiding the phone again when the door opened. Nurse Dorothy Marsh stepped inside, her expression shifting immediately when she saw Vivian's face. "Mrs. Whitmore, what happened?" "Nothing." The lie came automatically. "I just had a bad dream." Dorothy looked at the monitor, then at Vivian's pale face, then at the position of her arms beneath the blanket. Something flickered in her eyes. "May I check your vitals?" Before Vivian could refuse, Dorothy gently lifted her arm from beneath the blanket. They both stared at the angry red welts already forming across her skin. "These are not from a dream," Dorothy said quietly. Vivian opened her mouth to explain, to lie, to do something, but footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. Garrett appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from pleasant to concerned with practiced ease. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Stepping inside, Dorothy hesitated, still holding Vivian's arm. "Your wife appears to have some unusual marks," she said carefully. "I was just about to document them." Garrett moved closer, and Vivian watched the silent calculation behind his eyes. He took in the situation, the suspicious nurse, the evidence of violence, and made his decision in an instant. "Oh, those—" He shook his head sadly. "The doctor warned us about this. She has been scratching herself in her sleep. The stress causes her to act out." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "She has a history of mental health issues. The pregnancy has made them worse." Dorothy looked at Vivian. "Is that true?" Every instant screamed at Vivian to tell the truth, but Garrett's hand had found hers beneath the blanket, his fingers squeezing a warning. "Yes," she heard herself say. "I do not remember doing it." Dorothy's expression did not change, but something hardened behind her eyes. She released Vivian's arm and made a note on her tablet. "I will inform the doctor," she said neutrally. "Perhaps we should discuss adjusting your medication." After she left, Garrett released Vivian's hand and checked his watch. "I warned you about stress, darling. Perhaps Natasha should visit more often." He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "For your own good." He walked out, leaving Vivian alone with her pain and her terror and the steady beeping of a monitor that measured exactly how close to breaking she had come. 3 days passed in a blur of fear and carefully hidden documentation. Vivian wrote everything down. Every visit from Natasha, every cold word from Garrett, every dismissive glance from Dr. Franklin Webb, who seemed far more interested in maintaining his relationship with the wealthy Whitmore family than in questioning the marks appearing on his patient's body. She waited until the night shift changed at 3 in the morning, when the hallways were quietest and the attention was thinnest. Her phone felt like a lifeline in her trembling hands as she dialed 911 and pressed the device to her ear. 911, what is your emergency?" "My name is Vivian Whitmore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am a patient at St. Helena Memorial Hospital, maternity ward, room 417. My husband and his mistress have been assaulting me. I am 7 months pregnant and I fear for my life." "Ma'am, I am dispatching officers to your location now. Can you stay on the line?" "No, they will hear. Please hurry." She ended the call and hid the phone just as footsteps approached outside her door. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it would give her away. But the footsteps passed without stopping. 47 minutes later, Vivian heard the most beautiful sound of her life. Police radios crackling in the hallway. Authoritative voices asking questions. Someone was finally coming to help her. 2 officers appeared in her doorway, their uniforms crisp and official. Vivian felt tears of relief streaming down her face. "Mrs. Whitmore." The taller officer stepped into the room. "We received a call about a domestic disturbance." "Yes." The word came out as a sob. "Please, you have to help me. My husband and his mistress have been hurting me." They are trying to make me lose the baby. The officer's expression was sympathetic. Can you tell us more about what has been happening? Before Vivian could respond, Garrett appeared in the doorway. He was dressed impeccably despite the hour, his face arranged in an expression of weary concern. Officers, he said smoothly. Thank you for coming. I apologize for the inconvenience. Sir, your wife has made some serious allegations. I know. Garrett sighed heavily. This is not the first time. I am afraid Vivian has a history of paranoid episodes. The pregnancy has exacerbated her condition significantly. That is not true. Vivian struggled to sit up. He is lying. Dr. Webb arrived moments later, a tablet in his hands and an expression of practiced concern on his face. Officers, I am Dr. Franklin Webb, Mrs. Whitmore's attending physician. I can confirm that she has been experiencing pregnancy-induced psychosis. We have documented several episodes of delusional behavior. He turned the tablet to show them. Vivian caught a glimpse of official-looking documents, psychiatric evaluations with her name on them, records she had never seen before because they had never existed until Garrett needed them. She has made these accusations before, Garrett added sadly, against nurses, against other patients. The stress has disconnected her from reality. No, Vivian's voice rose in desperation. He had those documents forged. Check my arms. You will see the bruises. The shorter officer stepped closer, his expression uncertain. Ma'am, could you show us? Vivian pushed up her sleeve, revealing the welts and bruises that covered her forearms. The officers exchanged a glance. She does that to herself, Garrett said quietly. During her episodes, the doctor has notes documenting her self-harming behavior. Dr. Webb nodded gravely. It is a tragic but well-documented symptom of her condition. Vivian watched in horror as the officer's expressions shifted from concern to pity. Not pity for her as a victim, pity for her as a crazy woman who could not distinguish reality from delusion. Ma'am, the tall officer said gently, it sounds like you are in good hands here. The doctor and your husband are taking care of you. They are lying, please. You have to believe me. Her raised voice, her tear-streaked face, her frantic gestures, everything she did to convince them only confirmed the story Garrett had constructed. We are very sorry for the disturbance. Officers, Garrett said, moving to stand beside the bed. I will make sure she gets the help she needs. The officers nodded sympathetically and left. Vivian heard their retreating footsteps, heard them apologizing to Garrett in the hallway, heard her last hope walking away. Dr. Webb excused himself with a promise to increase her sedation. Garrett waited until they were alone before speaking. That was very foolish. Vivian, please. She was beyond pride now. Just let me go. I will disappear. I will not fight you for anything. Just let me take my baby and leave. Garrett leaned close, his handsome face twisted with contempt. Let you leave with my heir. My mother would never allow it. The inheritance requires a Whitmore child. You are simply the vessel. He straightened and adjusted his cuffs. I own this hospital. Vivian, I own this town. I own you, Tao. He signaled to someone in the hallway, Bao. An orderly appeared with a syringe. This will help you sleep, Garrett said pleasantly. And tomorrow, I think Natasha should visit again. You clearly have not learned your lesson. Vivian tried to fight as the needle slid into her IV line, but her body would not cooperate. The sedation pulled her down into darkness, while Garrett watched with cold satisfaction. Outside the room, Nurse Dorothy Marsh stood in the shadows of the hallway. She had heard everything. She had seen the officers leave. She had watched Dr. Webb produce documents that she knew had not existed in the official records that morning. Dorothy had survived an abusive husband of her own 20 years ago. She knew what it looked like when a woman was telling the truth and no one would believe her. She pulled out her phone and made a note of everything she had witnessed. Someone had to believe Vivian Whitmore. Someone had to help her. Theodore Caldwell sat alone in his modest townhouse, surrounded by boxes of case files and memories of a life that had somehow passed him by. The phone call came at 7 in the morning, pulling him from a restless sleep filled with dreams of his daughter. A woman's voice, professional and detached, informed him that Vivian Whitmore had been hospitalized with pregnancy complications and psychiatric disturbance. I am sorry, Theodore said, his heart suddenly racing. Did you say psychiatric? Yes, sir. Whitmore listed you as her emergency contact several years ago. Her husband wanted us to inform you of her condition. Theodore hung up and stared at the wall for a long moment. His prosecutor's instincts, dulled by 3 years of retirement and regret, began to stir. Psychiatric complications. In his experience, that phrase was used in two situations. Either someone was genuinely ill, or someone wanted them to appear that way. He thought about the last time he had seen his daughter. She had stood in her elegant living room, choosing Garrett over him, telling him to leave and never come back. He had honored her wishes because he loved her. He had told himself she needed to learn her own lessons. But psychiatric complications during pregnancy that did not match the brilliant, strong-willed woman he had raised. Theodore dressed quickly and drove to St. Helena Memorial Hospital. The lobby was all marble and expensive artwork, the kind of place that catered to families who could afford privacy and discretion. Theodore approached the reception desk and gave his name. "I am here to see my daughter, Vivian Whitmore." The receptionist typed something into her computer, then frowned slightly. "I am sorry, sir, but Mrs. Whitmore's visitor list is restricted. Only her husband is authorized at this time. I am her father. I understand it, but the restriction was put in place by her husband and her physician. I am afraid I cannot make exceptions." Theodore felt the familiar cold anger of a prosecutor facing obstruction, but he had learned long ago that brute force rarely worked against institutional barriers. Persuasion was more effective. "I see," he said calmly. "Perhaps I could speak with someone about having my name added to the list. I have traveled quite a distance, and I am very concerned about my daughter's welfare." The receptionist hesitated, then picked up her phone. 10 minutes later, Garrett Whitmore appeared in the lobby. He looked exactly as Theodore remembered. Handsome, polished, charming in a way that made Theodore's skin crawl. His smile was warm as he extended his hand. "Theodore, but what a surprise. Vivian did not mention you were coming." "I received a call from the hospital." Theodore shook the offered hand briefly. "I wanted to see her." Garrett's expression shifted to one of careful concern. "I appreciate that, truly, but I am afraid Vivian is not doing well. The pregnancy has triggered some psychological issues that we did not anticipate. Her doctors feel that visitors might cause additional stress. She is my daughter, and she is my wife." Garrett's smile did not waver. "I have to prioritize her health and the health of our child. I am sure you understand." Theodore studied the man before him. 3 years ago, he had seen through Garrett's facade immediately. Now, with more experience and nothing left to lose, he saw even more clearly. "Of course," Theodore said mildly. "Perhaps we could discuss her condition somewhere more private. I would like to understand what we are dealing with." Something flickered in Garrett's eyes. Calculation. Assessment. Then he nodded. "Certainly. Follow me." They walked through the hospital corridors, Garrett providing a smooth narrative about Vivian's declining mental state, paranoid episodes, accusations against staff, self-harming behavior. Theodore listened without comment, cataloging every detail. They passed a nurse's station where an older woman with silver-streaked hair glanced up briefly. Her eyes met Theodore's for just a moment before returning to her work. When they reached the private waiting room outside the maternity ward, Garrett gestured for Theodore to sit. "I know this is difficult to hear," Garrett said sympathetically. "Your daughter was a brilliant woman, but pregnancy changes brain chemistry in unpredictable ways. Has she been violent?" "Only toward herself. The bruises on her arms are self-inflicted." Theodore nodded slowly. "And the accusations she has made against you and this woman she claims is assaulting her." Garrett sighed heavily. "Pure fabrication. I am afraid there is no other woman. Vivian has constructed an elaborate delusion to explain her own deteriorating condition. The doctors have documented everything. I would like to see her, just for a few minutes." Garrett hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes, but please do not upset her. Any emotional agitation could trigger early labor." Theodore followed Garrett to room 417. The door opened to reveal his daughter lying in a hospital bed, pale and thin, her eyes closed. A fetal monitor beeped steadily beside her. "I will give you some privacy," Garrett said, stepping back. "But I will be right outside." The door closed. Theodore moved to his daughter's bedside and looked down at her. Vivian's eyes opened. For a moment, confusion clouded her face. Then recognition dawned, followed by something that broke Theodore's heart. Hope. Dad, her voice was barely a whisper. You came. I came. He leaned closer, keeping his voice low. Tell me the truth. What is happening to you? Vivian glanced at the door. They watch everything. They listen. Then tell me quickly. Her eyes filled with tears. The margins, my chart. Read the margins. Theodore straightened and casually picked up the medical chart hanging at the foot of her bed. He flipped through the pages, and there, written in the spaces between printed text, he found his daughter's handwriting. Dates, times, descriptions of assaults, names, evidence documentation in the legal shorthand he had taught her as a child. His heart went cold. I believe you, he said quietly. I am going to help you. Vivian's sob was silent, but her whole body shook with relief. Not yet. Theodore continued. If I act now, they will move you somewhere I cannot reach. I need to build a case. I do not know how much longer I can survive this. Theodore squeezed her hand gently. You survived this long. You documented everything. You are still fighting. He met her eyes. I failed you once. I will not fail you again. The door opened and Garrett appeared. Time is up, I am afraid. The doctor wants her to rest. Theodore nodded and released his daughter's hand. Take care of yourself, Vivian. He walked past Garrett without looking at him, his mind already racing through possibilities. In the hallway, the silver-haired nurse from before fell into step beside him. Mr. Caldwell, she said quietly. My name is Dorothy Marsh. I think we should talk. Theodore met Dorothy Marsh in the hospital cafeteria, choosing a corner table where they could speak without being overheard. Tell me everything, he said. Dorothy stirred her coffee slowly, organizing her thoughts. I have been a maternity nurse for 32 years. I have seen every complication, every emergency, every tragedy this job can offer. What is happening to your daughter is not a psychiatric episode. You have seen the marks on her arms. I have seen them. They are not self-inflicted. The angle is wrong. The pattern is wrong. Someone is hitting her with something flat and flexible. A belt, perhaps. Dorothy's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. I survived a marriage like your daughter's. I know what it looks like when a woman is telling the truth and no one will believe her. Theodore leaned forward. What about the psychiatric records her doctor showed them to the police? Those records did not exist until 3 days ago. I know because I check patient charts every morning. The entries appeared overnight, backdated, with signatures that look authentic but were not made in my presence. Dorothy met his eyes. Someone is manufacturing evidence against her. Dr. Webb. He has been the Whitmore family physician for 20 years. The family donates millions to this hospital. Draw your own conclusions. Theodore processed this information rapidly. His prosecutor's mind was fully engaged now, sorting evidence, identifying vulnerabilities, constructing strategy. What about security cameras, he asked. There must be footage of who enters her room. Dorothy shook her head. The camera outside room 417 is misaligned. It points away from the door. I noticed it the day your daughter was admitted. At the time, I thought it was an accident. Now I am not so sure. Convenient. Very. Theodore sat back and considered his options. He had spent 30 years putting criminals in prison. He knew how investigations worked, how evidence was gathered, how cases were built. He also knew that Garrett Whitmore had money, connections, and a willing accomplice in the hospital administration. If Theodore acted directly, Garrett would simply have Vivian transferred to a psychiatric facility where no one could reach her. The commitment papers were probably already drawn up, waiting for the right moment. He needed to be smarter. He needed to let them incriminate themselves. I have a colleague, Theodore said slowly, a family law attorney named Colleen Hargrove. She specializes in cases involving coercive control and domestic abuse. I think she should be involved. What do you need from me? Documentation. Everything you observe, everything you remember. Times, dates, any interactions you witnessed between Vivian and her husband or this woman, Natasha. The original nursing notes before they were altered. Dorothy nodded. I have been keeping my own records. I had a feeling someone would need them eventually. You are taking a significant risk. So is your daughter. Dorothy's expression hardened. Every day she stays in that room, she is in danger. Her baby is in danger. Someone has to do something. Theodore reached across the table and shook her hand. Thank you, Mrs. Marsh. Call me Dorothy, and do not thank me yet. Thank me when she is safe. That evening, Theodore called Colleen Hargrove from his car in the hospital parking lot. I need your help, he said without preamble. My daughter is being held against her will at St. Helena Memorial. Her husband and his mistress are assaulting her. The hospital is covering it up. There was a brief silence on the line. That is a serious accusation, Theo. I have documentation. My daughter has been recording everything she can. A nurse is willing to testify about falsified medical records. What do you need from me? Subpoenas for the original hospital records before they can be fully altered. Research into Garrett Whitmore's background, and legal framework for recording conversations in Connecticut. Connecticut is a one-party consent state. You only need one person in the conversation to agree to being recorded. Good. I want to let them hang themselves. Colleen was quiet for a moment. You are planning something dangerous. Theo, my daughter is pregnant and being beaten in a hospital bed. Dangerous is relative. All right, I will start pulling records tonight. Meet me at my office tomorrow morning. Theodore ended the call and looked up at the hospital windows. Somewhere inside, his daughter was alone and afraid. He thought about all the years he had spent prosecuting criminals, putting them in prison, delivering justice for victims who had no voice. Now the victim was his own child, and he would burn the world down before he let them destroy her. The next morning, Theodore met with Colleen in her downtown office. She had already assembled an impressive amount of information. Garrett Whitmore inherited his position at the hedge fund from his father, Colleen explained, spreading documents across her desk. Old money family, the mother, Eleanor Whitmore, controls the family trust through a complex inheritance structure. What kind of structure? The bulk of the fortune passes to the next generation only if there is a legitimate heir, a child born within marriage. Without that child, Garrett gets a modest annual allowance and nothing else. Theodore understood immediately. He needed Vivian to get pregnant, but he does not necessarily need Vivian herself. If she were declared mentally unfit, he could potentially gain custody of the child and file for divorce on grounds of her incapacity. A convenient psychiatric breakdown. Exactly. Colleen handed him another folder. There is something else you should see. Garrett has been married before. Theodore opened the folder and felt his blood run cold. 3 women, 3 previous relationships. 2 ended in divorce after the women were hospitalized for mental health crises. The third, a woman named Margaret Foster, had died in a car accident 2 years after her marriage to Garrett ended. The divorce records cite psychiatric instability in both cases, Colleen said quietly. The death was ruled accidental, but the pattern is troubling. He has done this before. It appears so, and he is very good at it. Theodore stared at the photographs of the women, young, intelligent, accomplished, women who had trusted the wrong man and paid the price. I want him destroyed, Theodore said softly. Not just stopped, destroyed. Then we build an airtight case. We let him confess to his own crimes, and we make sure he never hurts anyone again. The next assault came without warning. Vivian had managed to reduce her sedation by pretending to swallow pills and spitting them out later. Her mind was clearer than it had been in days, which made the fear sharper but also made her more capable of fighting. She had just finished documenting her previous day's observations when the door opened and 3 people entered her room. Garrett came first, his expression blank. Natasha followed, her red dress replaced by a sleek black outfit that somehow made her look even more dangerous. And behind them both, a woman Vivian had met only twice before. Eleanor Whitmore, Garrett's mother, 70 years old with silver hair and cold eyes. Close the door, Eleanor said. Natasha obeyed, engaging the lock with a soft click. Eleanor approached the bed and looked down at Vivian with undisguised contempt. You have caused my family a great deal of trouble. I have not done anything wrong. You married my son under false pretenses. You failed to maintain the standards expected of a Whitmore wife. And now you are creating complications that threaten everything we have built. Eleanor's voice was ice. This ends today. Natasha moved to stand beside the bed, one hand resting casually on her bag, the bag that Vivian knew contained the belt. Your father has been asking questions. Garrett said. That was foolish. You should have kept him away. I did not contact him. The hospital did. Regardless, his involvement has accelerated our timeline. Garrett pulled out his phone and checked something on the screen. Mother has arranged for your transfer to a psychiatric facility this afternoon. The commitment papers are already signed. Vivian's heart stopped. You cannot do that. I can do whatever I want. Garrett's smile was empty. You are my wife. The doctors have diagnosed you as mentally incompetent. Your father has no legal standing. No one is coming to save you. The baby will be delivered at the facility under medical supervision. Then you will remain there, receiving treatment for your condition, while I raise my heir properly. He tilted his head. You might even be released eventually, in 10 or 15 years, when the child no longer remembers you. Eleanor stepped closer. This is what happens to women who overreach. Vivian, you thought you could marry into the Whitmore family and share in our legacy. You were always just a vessel. Nothing more. Natasha withdrew the belt from her bag. One more lesson, she said softly. Something to help you remember your place. The first strike was harder than before. Vivian screamed before she could stop herself, the pain searing through her arm. The second strike caught her shoulder. The third hit her thigh. The fetal monitor began shrieking. Vivian felt it before she understood it. A tightening in her abdomen that was different from before. More intense. More urgent. Contractions. Real contractions. Stop, she gasped. Something is wrong. Natasha paused, belt raised. Eleanor looked at the monitor, then at Vivian's face. She is faking, Eleanor said dismissively. Continue. The next strike landed on Vivian's hip. The contraction that followed made her vision blur. She screamed again, not from the belt, but from the pain tearing through her belly. The baby is coming, she sobbed. Please. You will kill her. Garrett glanced at the monitor, his expression flickering with something that might have been concern. Not for Vivian, for his heir. That is enough, and he said, we cannot risk the delivery happening here unsupervised. Eleanor made a noise of disgust. Weak, both of you. Natasha lowered the belt reluctantly and tucked it away. She straightened Vivian's blanket with mocking gentleness, smoothing away the evidence of what had just happened. The ambulance will be here in 2 hours, Garrett said to him. Try to stay calm. Stress is bad for the baby. They left together, the door closing behind them. Vivian lay gasping, her body racked with pain and terror. The contractions continued, irregular but insistent. The monitor beside her showed numbers that made no sense through her tears. The door opened again. Dorothy Marsh entered quickly, her face tight with concern. She checked the monitors, then Vivian's pulse, then her eyes. How long have you been contracting? I do not know. A few minutes. Please, you have to help me. They are transferring me this afternoon. I know. I heard them talking. Dorothy adjusted something on the IV line. This will slow the contractions. You are not ready to deliver yet. They are going to commit me to a psychiatric facility. They forged the papers. I know that too. Dorothy leaned close, her voice barely audible. Your father has a plan. He needs you to hold on a little longer. I cannot. Vivian was sobbing openly now. I cannot survive any more. Yes, you can. Dorothy's hand found hers and squeezed firmly. You have survived this long. You have documented everything. You are still fighting. Do not give up now. What is the plan? He would not tell me the details, but he said to tell you one thing. Dorothy met her eyes. The trap is set. They just need to walk into it. Vivian closed her eyes as another contraction rippled through her. The pain was intense, but the medication was working. The intervals were lengthening. I need you to stay calm, Dorothy said. Can you do that? For your daughter. Vivian placed both hands over her belly and felt the movement beneath her palms. Her daughter. Still alive. Still fighting. Yes, she whispered. I can do that. Good. Dorothy straightened and resumed her professional demeanor. I will be right outside. No one will touch you while I am on duty. After she left, Vivian lay still, focusing on her breathing. The terror had not diminished. If anything, it had grown worse with the knowledge that time was running out. But somewhere beneath the fear, something else had kindled. Hope. Theodore worked through the night. Colleen had secured emergency subpoenas for St. Helena's original admission records, the ones that existed before Dr. Webb's alterations. Comparing them to the current files revealed systematic falsification, dates changed, diagnoses added, nursing notes modified. "This is enough to destroy Webb's license," Colleen said, highlighting discrepancies on her laptop screen. "But we need more to get Garrett and Natasha. We need confessions." "How do you plan to get those?" Theodore opened a briefcase and withdrew a small recording device. "Connecticut allows one-party consent. If I can get them to talk while I am present, legally, everything they say is admissible. That is assuming they will talk. Garrett has been careful so far. He has been careful because he believed no one was watching." Theodore's expression was grim. Tomorrow, they plan to transfer Vivian to a psychiatric facility. They think they have won. People who think they have won become careless. "What exactly are you planning?" Theodore explained. Colleen listened, her expression shifting from concern to reluctant admiration. "That is either brilliant or insane," she said when he finished. "Probably both. If it goes wrong, they could accelerate the transfer. You might never see your daughter again." "If I do nothing, I definitely never see my daughter again." Theodore met her eyes. "I spent 30 years putting criminals in prison. I know how they think. I know how they operate. And I know that pride is always their weakness." Colleen nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Be ready at the police station with everything we have. The falsified records, Dorothy's nursing notes, the background information on Garrett's previous marriages. When I give the signal, I need law enforcement moving immediately." "Understood." Theodore returned to the hospital late that evening. He needed to communicate with Vivian without being detected, which meant going through Dorothy. He found the nurse at her station, pretending to review charts while actually watching Vivian's door with fierce attention. "I need you to deliver a message," Theodore said quietly. "What kind of message?" "Tell her that tomorrow is the day. She needs to play weak. Let them believe they have completely broken her. The more confident they are, the more they will talk." Dorothy nodded. "She can do that. She has been doing it for days." "There is one more thing." Theodore hesitated. "I need her room door to be slightly open tomorrow morning. Not enough to be obvious, just enough that sound carries into the hallway. That is against protocol." "I know." Dorothy studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded again. "I will make it happen." Theodore thanked her and left the hospital. He had one more preparation to make. He drove to a location he had identified earlier, a spot in the hospital parking structure where he could observe the maternity wing entrance without being seen. From there, he could monitor arrivals and departures. He could see when Garrett and Natasha entered. He could be ready to move at exactly the right moment. The night passed slowly. Theodore did not sleep. He sat in his car, reviewing the case file Colleen had assembled, memorizing every detail. The previous wives, the suspicious death, the pattern of behavior that stretched back more than a decade. Garrett Whitmore was not just an abusive husband. He was a predator who had refined his methods over years of practice. He had learned how to isolate his victims, how to manufacture evidence of mental illness, how to weaponize the medical system against the women who trusted him, and he had been getting away with it for far too long. As dawn broke over the hospital, Theodore made a final call to Colleen. "Everything is in place," she confirmed. "Detective Morrison is standing by with arrest warrants. We just need the confession. You will have it. Be careful, Theo." Theodore ended the call and watched the sun rise over the building where his daughter waited. Today, one way or another, this would end. At 9:15, a familiar car pulled into the hospital parking lot. Garrett emerged first, followed by Natasha. A third car arrived moments later, and Eleanor Whitmore stepped out, her silver hair immaculate, her posture rigid with authority. All three conspirators had come together. Perfect. Theodore waited until they entered the building, then followed at a careful distance. He positioned himself in the hallway outside the maternity ward, in the spot where Dorothy had told him the curve of the wall would provide cover. He could hear voices from inside room 417. The door was ajar, exactly as promised. Theodore pressed record on his device and listened. Inside room 417. Vivian lay motionless, her face pale, her eyes half closed. She had followed her father's instructions precisely. Play weak. Let them think they had won. It was not difficult. She was exhausted, in pain, and terrified. The performance required only that she stop pretending to be strong. Garrett approached the bed first. The ambulance will be here in 30 minutes. Your new home awaits. Vivian did not respond. She kept her breathing shallow, her expression vacant. Eleanor stood near the window, examining the view with obvious distaste. This hospital is adequate for emergencies, but entirely unsuitable for a long-term stay. The facility in Vermont will be much more appropriate. Vermont, Vivian whispered, allowing fear to show. That is so far. That is the point, dear. Eleanor's smile was cold. No unwanted visitors, no family members asking awkward questions. Just peace and quiet while you recover from your unfortunate breakdown. Natasha leaned against the wall, arms crossed. She is still fighting. You know, I can see it in her eyes. Not for long, Garrett checked his watch. Once she is committed, we control everything. Her medical care, her visitors, her communication with the outside world. In a few months, no one will remember she existed. What about the baby? Born under supervised conditions, then placed in my custody, Vivian will sign whatever documents are necessary. She does not have a choice. Well, Vivian let tears slip down her cheeks. Please, I will do whatever you want. Just let me keep my baby. Eleanor laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. You still do not understand. The baby was never going to be yours. Garrett needed an heir to satisfy the trust requirements. You were simply the most convenient incubator. We had this planned from the beginning, Garrett added, almost conversationally. The courtship, the marriage, the pregnancy, every step calculated. You should be flattered. We put considerable thought into selecting you. But I loved you. I know. That made it easier. Garrett shrugged. Love makes people blind. It makes them trust. It makes them ignore warning signs that should have been obvious. Vivian's hands trembled as she clutched the blanket. Your father saw through you. I should have listened. Theodore, Garrett laughed. The washed-up prosecutor who could not even keep his own daughter safe. He is irrelevant. By the time he figures out what happened, you will be locked away and the baby will be legally mine. He came to see me. I know. I allowed it. Actually, I wanted him to see how broken you have become. I wanted him to understand that he failed you completely. Garrett's expression twisted with satisfaction. The look on his face was priceless. Eleanor checked her phone. The ambulance is 15 minutes away. We should begin preparing her for transfer. Natasha straightened and approached the bed. One more thing first. She withdrew the belt from her bag and let it hang loose from her fingers. Vivian flinched visibly. Natasha, Garrett said with mild irritation. We discussed this. I know, but I want her to remember. Every time she closes her eyes in that facility, I want her to feel this. She raised the belt. That is enough. The voice came from the doorway. Everyone froze. Theodore Caldwell stepped into the room, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. Behind him, the door stood wide open. Get out, Garrett snapped. You are not supposed to be here. I heard every word. Theodore held up his recording device. Every confession, every admission, every detail of your little conspiracy. Eleanor's face went white. That recording is illegal. Connecticut is a one-party consent state. I consented to record my own conversations. And since I was listening the entire time, everything you said is admissible evidence. Garrett's composure cracked. You were outside the room. You were not part of the conversation. I was present. I heard. I recorded. That is all the law requires. Theodore smiled coldly. I spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor. Did you really think I would not know how to build a case against you? Natasha dropped the belt and backed toward the window. Eleanor stood frozen, her aristocratic mask crumbling. Garrett lunged for the recording device. Theodore sidestepped easily, putting the bed between them. Do not make this worse for yourself. Give me that recorder. No. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. Detective Morrison appeared in the doorway, flanked by uniformed officers. Garrett Whitmore, the detective said. Natasha Brennan, Eleanor Whitmore, you are all under arrest. Chaos erupted. Garrett shouted about lawyers and lawsuits. Eleanor demanded to speak with the hospital administrator. Natasha tried to slip past the officers and found her path blocked. Through it all, Vivian lay in her bed, watching with wide eyes as handcuffs clicked around the wrists of the people who had tormented her. Theodore moved to her side and took her hand. "It is over. You are safe now." "The recording," she whispered. "You got everything. Everything and more." Theodore squeezed her hand gently. "Colleen has been building a case for days. The falsified medical records, Dorothy's nursing notes, Garrett's history with previous wives. We have enough to destroy them completely." Vivian's tears came freely now, but for the first time they were tears of relief. Detective Morrison approached the bed. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to apologize. When we responded to your call, we should have investigated more thoroughly." "You believed them." "I did, and I was wrong." The detective's expression was grim. "That will not happen again." The officers led Garrett, Natasha, and Eleanor toward the door. As they passed, Garrett turned his head to look at Vivian one final time. "This is not over," he said. "My lawyers will have me out within hours." Theodore stepped between them. "Your lawyers cannot help you. We have evidence connecting you to the deaths of 3 previous wives. This is not a domestic dispute. Garrett, this is a murder investigation." Garrett's face went gray. For the first time since Vivian had known him, he looked truly afraid. The officers pulled him away, and he disappeared into the hallway without another word. The full scope of what Theodore had uncovered became clear over the following days. Garrett Whitmore's first wife, a woman named Christina, had suffered a complete mental breakdown after 2 years of marriage. She had been committed to a psychiatric facility, divorced on grounds of incapacity, and died by suicide 3 years later. The official record showed a troubled woman who simply could not cope with her illness. The actual evidence, pieced together by Colleen and her team, revealed a systematic campaign of psychological torture, isolation from friends and family, gaslighting that made Christina doubt her own perceptions, manufactured crises that pushed her toward the edge. Garrett's second wife, Rebecca, had followed a similar pattern: commitment, divorce, and then a fatal car accident that was ruled a tragic coincidence. Investigators had found no evidence of foul play at the time. With fresh eyes and Garrett's confession on record, those investigators were looking again. The third woman, Margaret Foster, had been the one who almost escaped. She had recognized the warning signs early enough to leave before Garrett could complete his campaign. But a year after the divorce, she died in what appeared to be an accidental fall from her apartment balcony. 3 women, 3 deaths, and Vivian, who would have been the 4th. Theodore stood in the hospital hallway, reviewing the case file Detective Morrison had assembled. When Dorothy Marsh approached. "How is she?" Theodore asked. "Stable. The contractions have stopped completely. The baby is doing well." Dorothy paused. "She keeps asking when she can go home." "Soon. Colleen is working with the hospital to ensure her medical records are corrected and her mental health diagnosis is expunged." "What about Dr. Webb?" "His license has been suspended pending investigation. He is expected to face criminal charges for medical fraud and conspiracy." Dorothy nodded slowly. "Good. He should have protected her. That is what doctors are supposed to do." Theodore closed the file. "Thank you, Dorothy, for everything. Without you, I could not have saved her." "She saved herself." Dorothy's expression softened. "I just made sure someone was watching." The arraignment happened 3 days later in a courtroom packed with reporters and spectators. Garrett Whitmore stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, stripped of his expensive suits and polished confidence. The charges were read aloud: assault, conspiracy, medical fraud, endangerment of an unborn child, and pending further investigation, 3 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of his previous wives. Natasha Brennan, facing her own list of charges, had immediately offered to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony filled in the gaps that the recording had left, painting a complete picture of Garrett's methods and motivations. Eleanor Whitmore, the matriarch who had orchestrated so much of the conspiracy, remained defiant. She spoke of family honor and legacy, of preserving the Whitmore name, of doing what was necessary to protect her son. The judge was unimpressed. Bail was denied for all 3 defendants. The risk of flight was too high, the danger to witnesses too real. Vivian watched the proceedings from a secure room via video feed, her father at her side. When the judge's gavel came down, She exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath she had been holding for years. Is it really over? She asked. The criminal case is just beginning, Theodore admitted. There will be trials, testimony, appeals. It could take years. But they cannot hurt me anymore. No, they cannot. Vivian placed her hand over her swollen belly. I want to name her Hope. Hope Caldwell. No more Whitmore. I think that is perfect. The hospital discharged Vivian 2 weeks later, once the doctors were confident that her pregnancy had stabilized. Theodore drove her to his townhouse, the same modest home where she had grown up, where her mother had made dinner every Sunday, where life had been simple and safe. The nursery was already prepared. Dorothy had helped, along with Colleen and several other women who had heard Vivian's story and wanted to offer support. Pink walls, soft lighting, a crib that Theodore had assembled himself, following instructions he barely understood. Vivian stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. You did all this? People wanted to help. Your story reached them. What story? Theodore hesitated. There was some media coverage. The case received attention. How much attention? Enough. He put his arm around her shoulders. You are not alone anymore. Vivian, a lot of people are rooting for you. She leaned into him, allowing herself to be held for the first time in years. I am scared. What if I am not a good mother? What if I mess everything up? You will make mistakes. Every parent does. But you will also love her with everything you have. And that is enough. Vivian pulled back and wiped her eyes. Thank you for not giving up on me. Even when I pushed you away. You are my daughter. I will never give up on you. The weeks that followed were quiet. Vivian rested, ate properly, attended therapy sessions that helped her process the trauma she had endured. The nightmares came less frequently. The panic attacks faded, slowly, carefully. She began to rebuild. Theodore watched her progress with quiet pride. The brilliant, fierce daughter he remembered was emerging from the wreckage of her marriage, stronger than before. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Vivian asked the question that had been hanging between them. Do you think they will be convicted? Yes. Theodore's voice was certain. The evidence is overwhelming. Colleen and the prosecution team have built an airtight case. What if they get off on a technicality? What if Garrett's lawyers find a way? Then we keep fighting. We appeal. We pursue civil charges. We never stop. Theodore met her eyes. Justice is not always quick, Vivian, but it is persistent. And so are we. Hope Caldwell entered the world on a crisp October morning, screaming her displeasure at the bright lights and cold air of the delivery room. Vivian laughed through her tears as the nurses placed her daughter on her chest. The tiny body was warm and perfect, 10 fingers and 10 toes, a shock of dark hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She is beautiful, Dorothy Marsh said, standing beside the bed in her nursing scrubs. She had requested the shift specifically, wanting to be present for this moment. She is, Vivian whispered. She is everything. Theodore waited in the hallway, pacing with nervous energy until Vivian called him in. He approached the bed slowly, his hardened prosecutor's face softening into something almost childlike as he looked at his granddaughter. Hello, little one, he said quietly. I have been waiting a long time to meet you. Hope responded by yawning and closing her eyes. She has your stubbornness, Theodore told Vivian. I can already tell. Good, she will need it. The trials concluded 8 months later. Garrett Whitmore was convicted on all counts. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts for assault, conspiracy, medical fraud, and 3 counts of second-degree murder. His victims, women whose deaths had been dismissed as accidents or suicides, were finally recognized as what they had always been, casualties of a predator who had evaded justice for far too long. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Natasha Brennan received 15 years in exchange for her testimony. She would be eligible for parole in 10, assuming good behavior. Eleanor Whitmore, who had orchestrated much of the conspiracy and provided the resources that made it possible, was sentenced to 20 years. The Whitmore family fortune was seized under racketeering statutes, distributed among the victims' families and various domestic violence organizations. Dr. Franklin Webb lost his medical license permanently and served 3 years for medical fraud and conspiracy. The hospital faced a separate civil lawsuit that resulted in significant policy changes and financial penalties. Vivian watched the verdicts from her father's living room, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. When Garrett's sentence was announced, she felt nothing resembling satisfaction, just a quiet relief that it was finally over. "How do you feel?" Theodore asked. "Empty, moment," she admitted. "I thought I would feel victorious. Instead, I just feel tired." "That is normal. Victory does not erase trauma. It just allows healing to begin." Vivian looked down at her daughter's face. "I want to do something meaningful. I do not want any of this pain to be wasted." "What did you have in mind?" "I was thinking about law school, specifically victims advocacy, domestic violence cases." She met her father's eyes. "I want to be the person I needed, the person who believes women when no one else will." Theodore smiled slowly. "I think that is an excellent idea." 1 year after her release from St. Helena Memorial, Vivian stood at a podium in the state capitol building. Behind her sat rows of lawmakers, advocates, and survivors. In the audience, Theodore held Hope on his lap, watching his daughter with unmistakable pride. She wore a simple blue dress, no jewelry except her mother's wedding ring on her right hand. Her hair was shorter now, a deliberate choice, a visible break from the woman she had been. "I was a corporate lawyer once, Vivian began. "Top of my class, the youngest associate ever promoted at my firm. I thought I was intelligent. I thought I was strong. And yet I married a man who systematically destroyed my life. And I did not see it coming until it was almost too late." The audience was silent. People asked me how I let it happen, how a smart woman could fall for such an obvious predator. The truth is, there was nothing obvious about it. Abusers are skilled at what they do. They study their victims. They exploit their vulnerabilities. They create a reality where up is down and love is control, and asking for help seems more dangerous than staying silent. She paused, collecting herself. "I survived because people believed me. A nurse who recognized the signs of abuse when doctors dismissed them. A lawyer who understood that falsified records are evidence of conspiracy, not proof of mental illness. A father who never stopped fighting for his daughter, even when she had pushed him away." Vivian looked directly at Hope, who was reaching for Theodore's glasses. "I survived because I was lucky, but luck should not determine whether a victim receives justice. We need systems that protect vulnerable people instead of enabling their abusers. We need training for law enforcement, medical professionals, and judges. We need to believe women when they tell us they are in danger, even when believing them is inconvenient." She straightened her shoulders. "My name is Vivian Caldwell. I am a survivor of domestic violence, a mother, and soon to be a lawyer again. I stand before you today to advocate for every woman who has ever been told she was crazy for speaking the truth. Your stories matter. Your pain is real. And if no one else will fight for you, I will." The applause that followed was thunderous. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed and reporters gathered for interviews, Vivian stepped down from the podium and walked to where her father waited. He handed Hope to her without a word. "I am proud of you," he said simply. "I could not have done any of this without you. You would have found a way. You always do." Vivian held her daughter close, feeling the small heartbeat against her chest. The same heart she had feared would stop. The same life she had fought so desperately to protect. "What happens now?" she asked. Theodore smiled. "Now we go home, and tomorrow we keep fighting." Vivian nodded, understanding finally what her father had spent his entire career learning. Justice was not a destination. It was a process, a commitment, a choice made over and over again, in courtrooms and living rooms, in moments of triumph and moments of despair. She looked at Hope's face, peaceful in sleep, untouched by the darkness that had surrounded her birth. "We keep fighting," Vivian repeated. "Always." They walked out of the Capitol building together, 3 generations of Caldwells, into a future that was uncertain but no longer terrifying. The past could not be erased, but it could be transformed. Pain could become purpose. Silence could become advocacy. Victims could become survivors. And survivors, given enough time and support and love, could become warriors.